My father-in-law spent 6 years calling me the poor kid who rents. He said it at family dinners. He said it during holidays. He even said it at my wedding when he thought I couldn't hear him. To Frank, a man who didn't own a home wasn't responsible. He wasn't successful. He wasn't really a man yet. Then one afternoon, Frank stood in the lobby of the apartment building he had just moved into and complained about a clause in his lease. The property manager listened politely. Then she turned toward me, held out the paperwork, and said, "Andrew, the owner needs to approve this. Could you sign it?" Frank went completely still, because the son-in-law he had mocked for renting owned the roof over his head. My name is Andrew, and this is the story of how the man who spent years measuring my worth by property deeds eventually signed a lease with me as his landlord. When I met Laura, I lived in a rented apartment. It wasn't impressive. One bedroom, a narrow living room, a kitchen so small that you couldn't open the refrigerator and the oven at the same time. The building was old, the pipes complained whenever someone upstairs took a shower, and the window in the bedroom shook when the wind got strong. But I paid for it myself, every month on time. It was modest, but it was honest. I worked as an accountant for a small logistics company. The salary was decent, not spectacular, but stable. I had no luxury car, no designer clothes, no impressive address. What I had was a budget, a growing savings account, and a very clear idea of the life I wanted. I didn't want to look wealthy. I wanted to become financially secure. There is a difference. Some of my friends financed new cars the moment they received a raise. Others carried credit card balances because they wanted vacations, watches, and furniture that made their lives look more successful than they actually were. I kept driving the used car I had owned since university. I wore the same shirts until Laura threatened to throw some of them away, and every month I transferred a little money into savings. It wasn't dramatic, nobody applauded, but to me, every dollar was an invisible brick in a future I was quietly building. Andrew and I met during an evening finance course. She was social, confident, and incapable of letting an awkward silence survive longer than 5 seconds. I was the quiet man in the corner taking notes as if the instructor might test us without warning. During the break, she looked at my notebook and said, "You do realize this isn't school, right?" I said, "You do realize we paid for the course, right?" She laughed. Then she sat beside me. We had coffee after class, then dinner the next week, then another dinner. We fell in love quickly, but not recklessly. We wanted the same kind of life, peaceful, stable, no unnecessary debt, no expensive performance for people whose opinions didn't pay our bills. The problem was never Laura. The problem was her father. Frank had owned businesses and property for most of his adult life. He had a large house, a new truck every few years, and a talent for turning every conversation into a lesson about success. He was one of those men who believed luck had no role in anything he had achieved. In Frank's version of his life, every victory came from discipline, intelligence, and courage. Every person who had less simply hadn't worked as hard as he had. The first time Laura introduced us, he gave me a handshake that felt more like a test. "So what do you do, Andrew?" "I work in accounting for a small logistics company." He nodded once. Then he asked, "Do you own your home?" That was his second question. Not where I grew up, not what I wanted for the future, not how I met his daughter, straight to property. "Not yet," I said. "I rent." He leaned back and crossed his arms. "Renting." He repeated the word as though it tasted unpleasant. Then he gave me a small smile. "Well, everyone has to start somewhere." It sounded like encouragement. It wasn't. It was a verdict. From that day forward, Frank treated my rented apartment like evidence of a personal defect. He never insulted me directly enough to be confronted easily. He preferred comments delivered with a smile. At dinner, he would say, "A man needs something of his own before he starts talking about a family." Then he would look at me. At a barbecue, he said, "Rent is just money thrown away, but some people take longer to understand that." Again, the look. Always the look. If someone mentioned real estate, mortgages, investments, or renovations, Frank found a way to pull me into the conversation. Not to include me, to measure me. "So, Andrew, still renting?" "Yes, Frank." "Well, I suppose your landlord appreciates the loyalty." Then he would laugh. The people around him usually laughed too. Not because it was funny, because nervous laughter is how families protect the person everyone is afraid to challenge. Laura noticed every comment. At first, she apologized afterward. "He's old-fashioned," she would say. "He thinks property is the only proof that someone is responsible." I told her, "I don't need him to respect my financial choices. I need him to stop using them as entertainment." She agreed, and to her credit, she stopped remaining silent. The first time she confronted him was on a Sunday dinner. Frank had asked whether our landlord had raised the rent. I said yes, slightly. He shook his head. "That's the problem with not owning anything. Another man gets to decide what your life costs." Laura put down her fork. "Dad, enough." The room went quiet. Frank looked almost amused. "I'm only giving him advice." "No," she said, "you're insulting my husband and calling it advice." Frank's smile disappeared. "I want you to be secure." "I am secure," she said. "I'm with Andrew." "Well, when you have children, maybe you'll understand why I worry." Laura didn't retreat. "If we have children, they'll learn that a person's worth isn't measured by whether a bank approved their mortgage." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Frank changed the subject, but he didn't change his behavior. The worst moment happened at Christmas. The entire family was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, children running around the house. One of Laura's cousins announced that he had bought his first home. Everyone clapped. Frank stood, slapped him proudly on the shoulder, and said, "That's what a man does. He builds something of his own. He doesn't spend his entire life paying someone else's mortgage." Then he paused, just long enough. "Like some people." The table fell silent. Everyone knew who he meant. I felt heat rise into my face, but before I could respond, Laura spoke. "Dad, stop." Frank waved his hand. "Oh, relax. Andrew knows I'm joking." "No," she said. "He knows you're humiliating him into becoming the man you think he should be." Frank turned toward me. "Andrew, are you offended?" It was a trap. If I said yes, I was sensitive. If I said no, he would continue. So I answered honestly. "I'm not offended by the fact that you value home ownership, Frank. I'm tired of you using it to decide whether I deserve your daughter." Nobody laughed after that. Frank looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his drink. "Well," he said, "when you own something, maybe you'll understand." That night, while Laura and I drove home, I told her, "I will never let your father decide what I'm worth." She squeezed my hand. "I know. And I'm not buying a house just to prove something to him." "I know that too." But I would be lying if I said his words didn't affect me. They did. I just refused to let the pain turn into recklessness. I turned it into discipline. I kept my regular job. Then I started doing bookkeeping for small businesses at night, tax preparation during busy seasons, financial consulting on weekends. Nothing glamorous, mostly spreadsheets, receipts, and tired business owners who had ignored their accounts for 11 months and suddenly wanted a miracle. Some weeks I felt permanently attached to a calculator. I would finish my regular job, eat dinner with Laura, and work again until midnight. The extra income went into savings. Not a new car, not expensive furniture. Savings. Years passed. Laura and I got married. At the reception, one of Frank's friends asked him how he felt about gaining a son-in-law. Frank didn't realize I was standing behind him. He said, "Andrew's a good kid. It's just a shame he doesn't own anything yet. But Laura chose him." Laura chose him, as though I were a compromise she had made against expert advice. It hurt, but by then I had learned something important. You do not prove people wrong by arguing with them. You prove them wrong by becoming impossible to misunderstand. The opportunity came through a university friend named Kevin. He called me one evening and said, "I found something, but I need someone who understands numbers better than I do." It was an older apartment building in a neighborhood that was beginning to improve. Nothing luxurious. 12 units, stable tenants, a few repairs needed. The owner had health problems and wanted to sell quickly. The Kevin had experience with renovations.
I had the financial records, savings, and ability to create a serious business plan. The bank was willing to finance part of the purchase if we could provide a strong down payment and realistic projections. I studied the numbers for weeks: rent, taxes, insurance, maintenance, vacancy rates, repairs, worst case scenarios. I tried to convince myself not to do it, but the more I examined the property, the more sense it made.
I was afraid. Of course I was. This wasn't a small decision, but fear based on risk is different from fear based on appearances. I wasn't buying the building to impress anyone. I was buying an income-producing asset that I understood. Kevin and I signed the papers. Together, we became the owners, and then I went back to my rented apartment. That part confused people later. Why would a man who owned part of an apartment building continue renting somewhere else? Because the building was a business, not a trophy. The units were occupied. The rental income covered expenses and repairs. Laura and I liked where we lived. Moving simply to say I lived in property I owned would have been exactly the kind of decision Frank made, a decision built for appearance instead of strategy. For several months, I told nobody in Laura's family. Not even Laura knew until the purchase was fully closed and the first major repairs were complete. Then one night, I placed the documents on our kitchen table. She looked at them. "What is this?" "I bought something." Her eyes widened. "A house?" I smiled. "I didn't buy a house." I opened the folder. "I bought a building." She stared at me. Then she read the first page, then the second. When she understood, she looked up with tears in her eyes. "You own this?" "Part of it. Kevin and I do." "Is this why you've been working so much?" "For us, for the future." Then I admitted, "And maybe a small part of me needed to know that your father was wrong." She came around the table and hugged me. "We don't have to tell him," she said. "I don't want to." That surprised her. I explained, "If I announce it now, he'll think I did it for revenge. I want the building to succeed quietly. I don't want his approval attached to it." She nodded. So we kept it private. Meanwhile, Frank's own financial situation was beginning to change. The signs had been there for longer than anyone realized. He had expanded his business too quickly, opened a second location, bought new equipment, leased two expensive vehicles. Whenever someone asked whether it was too much, he said, "You have to spend money to make money." At one dinner, he bragged that he had refinanced the house for the expansion. I remember looking at Laura. She looked back at me. Frank treated debt like proof of confidence. He believed the next contract would solve everything. Then the contract fell through. A major client left. The second location started losing money. Interest rates rose. Bills piled up. At first, Frank pretended nothing was wrong. He continued driving the expensive truck, continued hosting dinners, continued speaking as if he were teaching everyone else how to succeed. But the confidence was changing. It had become louder, more defensive. People who feel secure do not need to remind everyone constantly. Then Laura came home one evening with tears in her eyes. "My parents are selling the house." I put down what I was doing. "What happened?" "The business debts. Dad used the house as collateral. They can't maintain the payments anymore." Frank had built his entire identity around owning that house. Now, keeping it would destroy them. "They're looking for somewhere to rent," Laura said. The word hung between us. Rent. I did not smile. I did not feel victorious. I felt sad, not because Frank had been right about me, because he had spent years believing property made him invulnerable. And now the same thing he used to judge others was being taken away from him. A week later, Laura said her parents had found an apartment. Where? She named the neighborhood. The same neighborhood as our building. I felt something tighten in my chest. "What's the address?" She didn't know. 2 days later, her mother sent Laura the lease and asked her to review it. Laura opened the document on her phone. Then she stopped breathing for a second. "Andrew." I looked at the screen. My building. Our property number. One of the recently renovated units on the third floor. Laura covered her mouth. "They applied to your building."
Kevin and I used a management company to handle applications. The manager had approved Frank and his wife based on the proceeds from their home sale, retirement income, and references. They had no idea who the owners were. I called Kevin. I explained everything. Then I said, treat them exactly like every other tenant. Same deposit, same rent, same rules. No favors and no punishment. Kevin laughed once. You're a better man than I am. I'm trying to be. Laura asked, are you going to tell Dad before they sign? I shook my head. No, their application was approved fairly. I don't want him to think I used the building to entrap or embarrass him. So when will you tell him? I don't know. The answer came sooner than expected. On moving day, Laura and I went to help. Frank stood in the apartment studying everything critically. The rooms are smaller than our house, he said. His wife reminded him gently, it's an apartment, Frank. He inspected the windows, the cabinets, the heating vents. Then he nodded. It'll do for now. I carried boxes upstairs, assembled a table, connected a television, helped him move the same furniture that once sat inside the house where he had mocked me for renting. He never thanked me directly, but he seemed quieter than usual. Near the end of the day, Frank discovered that the lease included only one reserved space. He wanted a second space added immediately. He walked downstairs to the management office. I was already there, reviewing a maintenance invoice with the property manager. Frank entered holding the lease. Excuse me, he said, there's a problem with the parking clause. The manager smiled. You have one assigned space, Mr. Miller. Additional spaces depend on availability. I was told something different, he said. I want it added to the lease. Any amendment requires owner approval, then call the owner. She looked toward me. I already knew what was coming. She held the lease out in my direction. Andrew, could you review this with him? Any change would need your signature. Frank did not move. The room became completely silent. He looked at her, then at me, then back at her. What do you mean, his signature? The manager answered naturally, unaware of the history standing in front of her. Andrew is one of the owners of the building. Frank stared at me. His face changed slowly, confusion first, then disbelief, then understanding. You own this place? One of the owners, I said. Yes. How long? A little over 2 years. He looked down at the lease in his hands. I watched him replay everything. Every dinner, every joke, every time he called me the poor renter, every time he explained what made a real man. He looked smaller in that moment, not because I had reduced him, because reality had removed the performance he had been hiding behind. The manager sensed the tension. I'll give you two a moment. She stepped out. Frank and I stood alone. You never said anything. I never asked what I was building, I said. You only asked whether I owned the apartment where I slept. He looked at me. I continued. I kept renting because it made financial sense. Owning property and living in property are not the same thing. He leaned against the counter. For once, Frank had no lesson ready. No joke, no hidden insult, just silence. Then he asked, did you know we were applying here? Not until after the manager approved you. And you let us move in? You qualified like anyone else. His eyes narrowed slightly. So now you get to hold this over me. No. I answered immediately. You will pay the same rent as everyone else. You will receive the same service as everyone else. And you will be treated with the same dignity as every other tenant. He looked away. I said, I know what it feels like to rent from someone. There's nothing shameful about it. That sentence landed harder than anything cruel I could have said. Frank took a slow breath. I suppose you've been waiting a long time for this moment. I imagined it, I admitted. Years ago, I probably would have enjoyed it. And now? Now I just wish you had respected me before you discovered what I owned. He looked down. Then he said something I had never heard from him before. I was wrong. Not complicated, not defensive, just wrong. He continued, I thought I was protecting Laura. I thought I was pushing you to do more. You were measuring me by the only thing that made you feel important. He looked up sharply, but he didn't argue because he knew it was true. After a long pause, he said, I owe you an apology. I nodded. Yes, you do. He looked surprised by my answer. Maybe he expected me to rescue him from the discomfort. I didn't, but I also didn't punish him. I said, you don't have to become a different person today. Just stop treating people as if their current situation tells you everything about who they are. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at the lease. What about the second parking space?
I almost laughed. There's a waiting list. For the first time that day, the corner of his mouth moved. Fair enough. Something changed after that. Not dramatically. Frank did not become warm overnight. He didn't start calling me for emotional conversations. He didn't suddenly apologize for every comment he had ever made. But the humiliations stopped. Completely. No more jokes about rent. No more speeches about what made a real man. When something in the apartment needed repair, he spoke to me respectfully. Andrew, the bathroom faucet is leaking. Could someone take a look? I'll send maintenance tomorrow. Thank you. Simple. Professional. Human. Several months later, Laura overheard him speaking to another tenant in the hallway. The man asked how Frank liked the building. Frank said, "It's well managed. My son-in-law owns it." Then, after a pause, he added, "He's a smart man. Built it quietly. I misunderstood him for a long time." Laura told me that night. I pretended it didn't matter, but it did. Not because I finally had Frank's approval, because the man who had reduced me to one financial fact had finally been forced to see the whole person. Laura and I still rent the apartment where we live. Yes, I own property and continue paying rent. That decision drives Frank slightly crazy, although he no longer comments on it. We will buy a home when the numbers, location, and timing make sense, not because someone believes we need one to look successful. I still drive a used car. I still work quietly. I still save. The difference is that I no longer feel pressure to show anyone what I am building before it is ready. Frank taught me something, though probably not the lesson he intended. A deed does not make someone honorable. A large house does not make someone wise. And losing either of them does not make someone worthless. A person's character is revealed by how they treat people who have less power, less money, or less status than they do. Frank treated me as if I were beneath him when he believed I owned nothing. When he discovered I owned the building where he lived, he finally showed me respect. I accepted the apology, but I never forgot the timing. So tell me honestly, would you have protected his dignity or made him pay for every insult? Drop your verdict in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because here, one story always leads to another.